and welcome to the CX Files for February 12th, 2026. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal. Mark, great to see you. Hope that all is going well in Sao Paulo. I can tell you here we're starting to see a little bit of the springtime that is beginning to pop out. The green shoots are there, but we are definitely very much of the view that still got a few weeks to go with the white stuff outside.
That's perfect. That's great. Well, everyone's getting excited here because next week is the Carnival. And so, if you try and get hold of anyone in Brazil next week, you can probably forget about it.
Well, I'll do my best to avoid. I've never been a big person for those big festivals and parties. Mardi Gras, nah, it's not for me.
Well, personally, I don't really go in for the big displays with the floats and that kind of thing. But one thing that the big celebration does draw in hundreds and hundreds of smaller parties. So and they always have a different theme. You can go to a party that's themed around the Beatles, or it has a very specific. There's a David Bowie one that's very close to me. So it's just funny to go and see 1,000 people dressed up as David Bowie having a party in the street in the middle of Sao Paulo.
I think that for a lot of people might constitute a fever dream, but that's another story for another day. No, I don't. Hold on. I love David Bowie. Please don't take that the wrong way. I'm just trying to imagine 1,000 of him. Yeah, no, it's not resonating. It's not resonating. And I think that, Mark, on a more somber note, we should call out the fact that it's 10 years since David Bowie passed away. It was January 2016, and he was the first in that year of a long spate of heroes that we all lost in the pop culture entertainment domain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, on that note, we're just kind of noticing that a lot of the people that became big, successful throughout the 60s, 70s, even the 80s now, they're getting old and they're passing on. So, I think that every month brings somebody new.
Yeah, no, well, this is it. And, we just have to appreciate these individuals while we have them around and take advantage of going to see them if they're playing, if they've got gigs, if they've got shows. And on that note, you're going to love this. I found out recently Glass Tiger is playing in Montreal, and it's going to be happening in April. I won't be traveling when they're playing, so I'm very excited to see them. I know that they had limited success outside of Canada, but here they were known as Canada's Duran Duran, and with good reason.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Personally, I've been trying to get Harry Styles tickets recently, so we'll see if that happens. Anyway, I think
He's too much. He's too much of a whippersnapper for me. Come on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, why don't we go into the subject that we've got this week? Because, we've just been talking about elderly rock stars, and I think that
Yeah.
that kind of maps onto our subject this week, doesn't it?
Yeah, in a roundabout way it does. And in terms of this week's interview, I was lucky to catch up with somebody who we've had on the podcast before, and that is a longtime friend, Jacqui Turner. Now, Jacqui is the head of Turner Corner Leadership Academy, but we weren't talking about training, which is usually what Jacqui does in her 9 to 5 job. We were actually talking about something that's very important for Jacqui, and that does fall into the domain of training, and it's how best to support vulnerable customers. You know, we're hearing more and more about people that are vulnerable, Mark, and it could be vulnerable due to age issues and some of the restrictions that might bring upon people, maybe a lack of understanding of technology, a lack of access to certain technologies and so forth, a lack of access to maybe even getting up and getting out of the house, mobility issues. But it also plays into other people that might be having different strains, maybe financially, from a mental health standpoint. And what I love about talking to Jacqui is she's able to break down what these challenges are in such a way that we don't just understand where the challenges lie, but also where the opportunities lie in regards to being able to help these individuals. How do we solve the problem? What's the path of least resistance to making certain that if you're running a contact center, you have an understanding about what vulnerability means and how best to address it to make sure that your agents on the front line are best equipped to handle this?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I had my own experience with this recently because if you know the main telco in the UK is BT, the old
Yeah.
British Telecom.
Mhm.
And right now, they're in the process of switching off all of their landlines across the entire country and
Oh,
switching all of their customers over to voice over IP. So that means that every customer needs to set up an internet router, even if they're not using BT for their internet provider. And my dad actually gave me a call and said, I've just got this box from BT and I don't even know what to do with it. And I said to him, they must have sent some instructions. They can't just expect people in their 80s to be setting up internet routers. And he said, well, I haven't really looked at it. And I went and looked on the BT website. They said, anyone who has any questions, we'll come out and help you. But we're not coming out. It was clear that they were not coming out by default and sort of going door to door. But if you need help, they would be there. And I called up my dad and told him that. By that time, he said, "Oh yeah, I looked at the instructions and it said just plug it into the wall and it works." So he actually found it incredibly simple to set it up anyway. But I think it just shows that sometimes big corporations can have expectations of customers that are just sort of far beyond their own skills.
well, this is it, and everybody's level of understanding, whether it's about a process, whether it's about a technology, a product, or a service, everyone's going to have a different level of awareness and an understanding of what to do. And I think that this is one of the key things that comes through in the chat that I have with Jacqui. We can't assume anything. There is no one size fits all formula for a situation with a vulnerable customer. And being able to think, being able to adapt is so crucial and I think primordial, if I can use that term, in regards to addressing somebody who might be contacting over the telephone or digitally who could be considered vulnerable and how best to move their issue, their problem, or their query forward.
Yeah, and absolutely. Obviously, here we're also talking about problems with services like utilities. Someone that may be struggling to pay their water bill,
Hmm.
and you can't realistically just go and turn off their water. In fact, I don't. I think in places like the UK, this is not even legal anymore to deny basic services to customers. So then it becomes a problem. You have to create a negotiation with a vulnerable customer that's struggling,
Yeah.
and try to work out a payment plan or some other sort of plan to help them. Where you're in a situation where you just can't deny them the service. This is not like Amazon just refusing to sell you
Yeah.
something because you can't pay for it.
There's a humanitarian element to it or a humanitarian aspect to it. And, Mark, think about the days maybe when your grandparents in the UK would have gone to pay their water bill or their power bill. What did you do? You went to the post office with a gyro and you paid it. It was that simple. In Canada, it was a very similar process, but things have evolved so quickly. I mean, for so many people, they aren't even getting mail service anymore. They might not be aware that they owe money on a water bill or a heating bill. And then they get debt collectors banging on their door and they don't know what to do. The reality is, for some people, access to the internet, access to email, access to e-billing just doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Even though you need this kind of access today to engage with most of modern society, but there's still a lot of people who have to engage with these services and pay these bills, and yet they might not be checking their email.
This is it. Well, listen, I think that we should dive into the chat that I had with Jacqui Turner and find out a little bit more, really from somebody who is an expert in this domain about what vulnerability means in the context of CX and what we as professionals in our industry can do to be more sensitive and more aware. This week's The CX Files is really excited to welcome a previous guest we've had on, I think it was a few years ago now. That is Jacqui Turner. Now, Jacqui is the founder of Turner Corner Learning Solutions. She joins us from her home office in the West Midlands. Jacqui, always great to catch up with you.
It's absolutely great to be a guest again on your wonderful podcast, Peter. I enjoyed it last time. You're quite right, it was a few years back. I can't remember just how many. But yeah, an absolute pleasure to be back and chatting to you again on a subject that I know we're both very passionate about.
Very much so, Jackie, very much so. And, as I think a little bit about the work that you do on LinkedIn, you have got probably, I'd say, one of the most positive and one of the most constructive LinkedIn feeds that I could recommend to anybody when it comes to our industry. You believe very strongly in not just learning for the sake of learning, but effective learning and how best training can be done. And when you and I were catching up a little while ago and we were talking about what you were passionate about and some of the different elements, it jumped out at me that you talked a lot about the need to provide high quality service to vulnerable customers. And for me, that really resonates. One of the things that we keep hearing about in the trade press or in CX circles is the extent to which organizations, doesn't matter what the industry, are trying to shift everything to online. They're trying to shift everything to automated portals, shall we say, etc. And something that's always jumped out to me is, well, what would happen if it was my 91-year-old dad who was being forced onto one of these portals? What if that human element, that human touch was taken away? And I'm really hoping that we can get into some of these different topics as we conduct this chat. But as a starting point, as a starter for 10, if we were to talk about the vulnerable customer segment and its importance, I would dare say that this is probably a new angle or a new segment or a new demographic for a lot of CX leaders. How would you define this group, and what would you say would be some of the key characteristics a vulnerable customer would be bringing to the table in an interaction with an enterprise or an organization?
Yes, Peter, I think vulnerability, I think, means different things to different people. And I think sometimes there's assumptions about, it's somebody that's of a certain age,
Yeah.
the easiest ones that come out, are people that have, some form of disability. That might be sort of, wheelchair users, etc. The ones that immediately might pop into people's minds. But it's it's literally anybody, depending on their personal circumstances, that may be deemed at being at, I guess, more risk of detriment based on those circumstances, and that could be, yes, it can be a permanent vulnerability. So somebody that's got a permanent disability or a permanent, long-term illness, but it can be short term. If I just think, and reflect on my own personal circumstances over, decades, I've been a single mum, with two children where and I've struggled, more financially than potentially I do now. So for a period of time, I needed help and support. But does that make me vulnerable permanently? No, of course it doesn't. So, it's widespread, first of all, in terms of many people will fall into that vulnerable category just due to a present situation. So that could be job loss. That could be, somebody that's really struggling to pay their bills. It could be somebody that has come out of a recent difficult relationship breakup. It could be somebody that suffered domestic abuse. And we talked earlier about age groups and the digital era, etc. But it's not just necessarily assuming that it might be somebody in their 80s or 90s that might struggle with, the digital world. That could be somebody much younger that potentially had a partner that controlled everything. And therefore, suddenly they find themselves having to, sign on a digital platform or to manage their finances, and that was something that they never had control of previously. So I think often we have to just take a step back and not make assumptions about ages and who can do what. But often some of the most typical are health issues, as I say, life events such as bereavement, job loss, difficult relationships. It could be low capability in terms of low literacy and, and digital skills. So, the latest research I saw was around something like 69 different vulnerabilities. Some obviously more sort of minor than others, but they encompass, some typical sort of behaviors. I think it's important for certainly if you're working in customer service to really pick up on the subtle cues sometimes and look out for the behaviors rather than necessarily trying to categorize what specific vulnerability a customer may have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes very much sense. It makes very much sense. And effectively, what we're saying here is that vulnerable customers can take a whole series of different forms, and that we should not immediately assume or pigeonhole one segment of the consumer population as potentially being vulnerable. There could be individuals who have more of a permanent element to the vulnerability. There could be ones where it might be more temporary. And I think your point about the fact that it could be literally anybody of any age coming in from any different segment makes sense, which makes it all the more important for those who are managing frontline teams to have an understanding about the implications of vulnerability when it comes to the consumer base.
Absolutely. And as I say, training is such a, it's not a nice to have. It's an absolute must have to train your teams, regardless of what industry you're in, for customer service teams to have the confidence to know how to support somebody. And one of the key things that when I'm training, people often say to me, I struggle to know how to ask somebody, in terms of what support they might need, because I feel I'm being intrusive, and I just don't know how to position these questions or to have the conversation that doesn't make somebody feel like vulnerability is a stigma.
Yeah.
Because often people put that own stigma on themselves. They don't even want to admit or to call themselves as vulnerable. And I think that's really important to train staff to have that confidence, to have that sensitive conversation, but reassuring conversation.
Jacqui, in your experience, are some industries or some segments of the economy more prone to dealing with vulnerable customers than others?
Um, as we said earlier, I think it goes across all industries, but I guess some of the most common prevalent ones will be financial services, anything to do with obviously, finances, needing financial support. I worked in the utilities industry for a period of time, so I worked for Welsh Water, and I know, in terms of they provided sort of social tariffs and support to help people that may be, finding it difficult to pay their water bills. So I think, certainly in terms of financial services, energy, utilities, if we're talking about people that need electricity for their medical equipment at home, for example. So, that's another, important sector that needs to really understand the need to proactively identify who those vulnerable customers may be. It shouldn't just be up to a customer to identify or to say, I am vulnerable, this is my situation. It's important for certainly, financial services, utilities, energy sectors, but also, I think a key one for me is insurance companies. I spent 17 years of my career working in insurance. I started as a claims assessor, and I took, at the age of, I would have been about 20, and I took my first call from a customer who told me if I didn't pay their claim there and then, and I was dealing with people that had long-term illnesses, that if I didn't pay their claim there and then, that actually they were suicidal and they had no reason to live. And I hadn't been trained on how to deal with that type of call. And even when I talk about it now, Peter, I still get that sort of feeling in my stomach, that anxiety of saying the wrong thing. And I was looking at the claim form thinking, I can't pay this claim because we were still waiting on information. So I think certainly the insurance sector, I think many people are vulnerable when they have to claim against their insurance policies. That might be due to a car accident. That might be due to something that's happened with their home. It might be due to mental health and illnesses.
Hmm.
So I think certainly, those sectors, I think, are more prevalent in potentially having a wider range of vulnerable customers, but also I've done some recent work with housing associations and councils. And you can imagine, certainly with council organisations, the different types of vulnerability from people who are homeless and
Yeah.
needing help and support, people that can't feed their children and so need help with food banks, etc. And I've worked with two London-based councils, the start of this year and really helping them to identify who their vulnerable customers are and how to support them. So, I know I've given quite a few different, industries there, but I think that just shows it's across every industry and every organization.
But that I think is very important because my suspicion is if you were to ask the average CX leader, where do you think vulnerability is going to hit most from an industry perspective, they would probably say healthcare. They'd probably
Mhm.
say pharmaceutical. They would probably say utilities, as you say, not wanting to get your power cut off or your water cut off, etc. But the reality is that there are significant impacts for individuals that have different vulnerabilities across all segments. And, I can think of lots of examples here. Think about your mobile telephone. If that's your only window to the world and you get a letter saying you're going to be cut off if you don't pay up in the next couple of weeks, I could just imagine the trauma that that would cause somebody who's got a level of vulnerability.
Absolutely. So, that's why I think it's so important to really for companies to have the data to look at the customer feedback, to really understand before even somebody gets to a point that they're struggling or have to call them to say, look, this is my situation, being able to quickly recognize if somebody has perhaps missed payments, even just a couple of times, together with potentially previous contacts that they've had with that person, to really understand what might be going on for that customer. Because again, I think some of the research I've seen, something like 47% of people wouldn't self-identify as vulnerable. They wouldn't like to use that word vulnerable. They wouldn't
Mhm.
want to be talked about in that way as vulnerable. So it's about understanding and really listening to what somebody is saying to you and also picking up on the behavior. So is somebody, for example, asking you to repeat information over and over again? So perhaps they're having difficulty with memory retention. It might be somebody's just struggling to understand easy terminology or processes, or they're having difficulty in explaining, what their need is and what their situation is. It's just about picking up on those cues. It might be long silences between the question and the answer. So it's listening out rather than trying to think, oh, is that person, um, you know, in this category of vulnerability, or actually, is it just about listening to this person right now, based on the conversation I'm having with them, clearly needs my help and support. And that might not be just needs my help and support in terms of a social tariff or, you know, some sort of help with my bills. It might just be that actual help and support on the call in terms of slowing down, repeating, offering to provide follow up written communication after you've had the conversation. Because if somebody's got Alzheimer's, for example, the chances are they're not going to have retained that information that you've just had
Exactly.
in a phone conversation.
100%. And as you talk a little bit about the differences and the subtle nuances that you need to, number one, pick up on, and number two, be able to respond in kind to, that provides, I think, a significant challenge in terms of the whole training mechanism for agents or for people on the front line to be able to recognize this. And that sort of in a roundabout way takes me to my next question, Jacqui, and that is the fact that we are in a multi-channel universe. We all recognize that as professionals in this space. So if I'm a CX leader and I'm thinking about the channels that I might need to incorporate into my vulnerable customer strategy, number one, do vulnerable customers default in your experience or your observation to one or two channels versus other ones? And the second question then is, especially in the case of non-voice channels, how do you train an agent to be able to pick up some of those nuances that you just discussed and to be able to respond in such a way that that individual on the other end who might need an extra level of care or an extra higher standard in terms of how they're going to be managed for an interaction, how do you impart that to an agent and make sure that they're 100% equipped to deal with a situation like that?
Really, really good points there, Peter. I think first of all, in terms of, different types of communication channels, this is something that I find very frustrating, where you have some companies that decide for their own benefits rather than the customers that we're going to close down certain channels, so we're not going to make it possible for people to have a phone call easily with us. It's going to be all online or digital. And yes, I think a sort of nice survey report, I think that was in this year, showed that around a third of people, and this might surprise some organizations, around 37% of people that were in that sort of vulnerable category said that they preferred digital to have conversations where it's not something that's complex or something that's emotional. So the reason behind some people preferring to, I guess, admit to some sort of vulnerability, it's easier to admit it when you're not actually speaking to a person, on a phone call. It's almost hiding behind that digital communication channel. And as I say, a third of people said they would find it easier to actually admit vulnerability through a digital channel rather than they would on the phone or face to face. Unless it's something that, and I think that, this goes, for all of us, I think, well, as soon as something becomes more complex, or as soon as something becomes a complaint or dissatisfaction, or there's an emotional element, then that's where the verbal communication then becomes a stronger channel for people. But again, it's important when I'm training teams to really look for those subtleties in terms of the language, the terminology, the questions that are being asked, whether that's digital or whether that's, face to face or whether that's on the phone. Are there, if it's a chat conversation, is there quite a bit of time between information that's being given and the response that's coming back from the customer? And that's something that's reoccurring throughout the conversation. Or are they asking questions, over and over again because they're not perhaps comprehending or fully understanding? Or as I say, they're just not retaining that information. And when I'm sort of doing training, I work actually with, I've got a great associate that I often co-deliver these sessions for companies with. And he's got an acting background as well as a qualified trainer in mental health and vulnerability. And we're doing a session later this month where to really help customer service professionals to have the confidence to pick up on these behaviors and to have those empathetic and reassuring conversations. We don't do role play. I'm not a lover of role play. Peter, you put me in a role play situation and I crumble. It's just not for me at all. But what Andy does, my associate, is we therefore act out, or he acts out, I certainly don't, different vulnerabilities. And then we therefore then team people up to then help them to respond to him based on these different vulnerability situations. So that could be somebody vulnerable in terms of, an illness. That could be somebody vulnerable in terms of they've had a recent stroke, so they're struggling to speak and get their words out. And that is far more powerful when I'm training teams to bring Andy on board and bring that extra, um, you know, I guess, quality to the training. And even though people originally say, "Oh, I'm not sure about this," and sort of doing a real play situation, all the feedback we've had has been fantastic. And people saying, "Look, that's really helped me to understand and to have that confidence to have the conversation." So I think how people are trained is important.
I couldn't agree more. It really comes down to, look, training, and you'll know better than anybody, Jacqui, has evolved so much over the course of the past few years. And the concept of just sticking a bunch of people into a classroom for 8 hours and bombarding them with PowerPoint slides is just not going to work. There needs to be a way of getting to people. Let's be frank, people have much shorter attention spans, and being able to capture at least some of the attention to inform them and to instruct them around how to handle this segment of customers is crucial. And let's talk a little bit more broadly here, just to finish off our chat this morning, or at least morning where I am. Um, let's be blunt. It's not been an easy time in the world the past few years. Mental illness is, by all accounts, at an all-time high. You're dealing with people who are stretched from both ends. You're dealing with an affordability crisis, whether it's in the UK, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, pretty well all around the world. The impact of all these strains in the macro level environment are going to have an impact on individuals. And that's going to effectively, as I can tell, raise the volume of people that could be considered vulnerable. How do you feel organizations, regardless of the sector, are dealing with this reality? And what advice would you have for CX leaders as they craft their strategies moving into 2026 and beyond on how best to incorporate vulnerable customers as an area of focus for their agents and for what they're looking to try and deliver from a CX perspective?
Well, I think first of all, it's important for every organization to have a vulnerable customer policy and framework in place. There have been times where I've been asked to deliver training to companies on vulnerable customers. And when I said, "Well, I have a look at your vulnerable customer policy?" So I'm aligning any training with that policy. And then suddenly there's a big gap there in terms
Yeah.
of, "Oh, we haven't got a policy." So it starts with having that policy and framework, and therefore then making sure that your teams are then trained on that policy and framework so they have that confidence. I know the Financial Conduct Authority, in the last couple of years have criticised some financial services in having a framework but not fully embedding that framework in terms of having gaps in their training and development. So I think that's important to make sure that it's not just a one-off training course. There are refreshers. It's something that vulnerability keeps evolving, and therefore policies need to keep evolving, training needs to keep evolving. So it can't be just a one-off, "Well, we've done that, tick box and move on." It's also important, I think, going forward to make sure, with obviously a lot of organizations across the world introducing more and more AI technology, is to really make sure that any AI technology that they implement into their organization has vulnerability at the heart of it. So making sure that any of the digital channels are equipped effectively to manage and support vulnerable customers that want to still use digital channels to do that, but also making sure that staff are therefore trained in those more complex cases, because that's where, as I said earlier, the phone conversations or the face-to-face conversations really are important to vulnerable customers. So it's about making sure that any move towards AI technology doesn't take away any communication channels for your customers. And I think it's important, therefore, for organizations to make sure that the policies in place, the trainers in place, but also the communication channels are accessible to customers to decide what's right for them and what their preferred channel is, rather than the company deciding for them.
Jacqui, this has been a fascinating discussion, and quite frankly, I think a discussion that we need to be having a lot more. So I cannot thank you enough for spending some time with us on your second CX Files appearance. And before we finish up, can you just let everybody know it, if in case they have any questions or need to get your opinion or point of view about how to manage their own vulnerable customer strategy, how can they get a hold of you?
The best way, I guess, they always see me on LinkedIn, occasionally doing a little bit of dancing, as you know, Peter.
Oh, yeah.
But they can certainly find me on LinkedIn, and also my website as well has all my contact details, so that's turnercorner.co.uk.
Great. Thank you very much, Jacqui.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Peter, as always.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.